And actually, with it being a Thursday, it is time once again to check in with Ammon Bundy, who launched his brand new radio show last week and is back once again to hold forth, as only Ammon can do. Ammon, how are you?
Doing well. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that, and thank you for the introduction. And I also want to thank the listeners for their time. I know that your time is as valuable as mine, and I want to thank you for that. And just let you know I recognize that your time is valuable, and thank you for spending it here. I wanted to kind of pick up a little bit where we left off last week to give you a little bit of background, more of myself, about my family, and really why I'm here on this radio show. And it's about you and myself. It's about your family, about my family, and about the great people in this country and across the world, actually. I also wanted to just reference that there is somewhat of an official Bundy story, if you will, and you could find that on my public page, which is on Facebook, which is Ammon Bundy, a public page. You can also go to YouTube and search in the Bundy story, and it's the one that is about 36 minutes long. And then you can go also to the Bundy Ranch page, and it's pinned at the top there. It's pinned at the top of the Ammon Bundy public page. And I felt like this might be best because obviously it goes into a lot more detail than I'm able to go into on the radio here, and I feel like also that it's important that we get some background, so that you can understand a little bit where I'm coming from, also maybe bring some validity to what I am saying. But continuing on, I talked a little bit about my family being there for now on that ranch for 143 years, how our rights were established there, and then how they were documented in the with the state of Nevada, and we gained title and deed to that. And then in around 1993, the Bureau of Land Management came to my father and basically said that we are going to close your allotments and take away your ranch. And they said that the reasoning for that is because the desert tortoise needs a mitigation area, and the Las Vegas area was expanding, and they needed a place to put the turtles, and they chose to put the desert tortoise on the Bundy Ranch and the surrounding ranches. And they also showed some science that they said was science. We know now is absolutely incorrect, just more of that fake science that showed that the cattle and the desert tortoise couldn't live together. It was unhealthy for the desert tortoise. And of course, the ranchers were like, that doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right. And so they went and started doing their own studies, or at least they hired science firms to come out and do their own study. And what did they find? Just the opposite of what the Bureau of Land Management was saying. And that is that the cattle were actually the primary reason for the increase of desert tortoise in the area. And that whenever the cattle increased, or the population of cattle increased, also the desert tortoise population increased. They also found that the cattle cultivated the land, fertilized the land naturally, and also that the cattle manure, the dung, was created good benefit, and when it dried up, the desert tortoise actually ate that their dung, and was a primary primary source of food. And so, interesting enough, this study was presented. It was presented in court, a federal court, and the court actually ruled that the study was correct the rancher study was correct, and that, which is, I guess it's kind of interesting that we go to a judge who really doesn't know anything about these matters. I mean, he's not a scientist, but ultimately it was his decision to decide that whose study was the correct study, and he decided that it was that the rancher study was the correct study. However, he also ruled that it didn't matter because the federal agencies get to decide what study they're going to use. And so ultimately, again, the corruption continued, or the nonsense continued. And so, of course, the Bureau of Land Management decided that they were going to use their study and base their decisions off of that study. And so the ranchers in that area continued to try to find legal grounds under the regulation of the Bureau of Land Management, the federal policies, and to see, you know, how they can maintain and save their ranches. And my father and many others began to dig and try to understand where their rights came from and how their rights were protected by the law. And ultimately, it brought them all the way to the wonderful document and the charter we call the United States Constitution. And understanding, at least coming to the understanding, that the United States Constitution was the supreme law of the land, is the supreme law of the land. And so, and understanding that Constitution, or digging into it and, you know, doing all they could to understand it, it became clear to them, to their attorneys, and also to those supporting them, at least the close support, that the founders established very strict rules in which the federal government, the general government as it's termed sometimes, they had very strict limitations on what property they can own and control inside an admitted state. When I say admitted, I mean admitted state in the Union. And Nevada certainly was an admitted state in the Union. It was admitted into the Union in 1864, shortly after the Civil War, and it was admitted by President Lincoln. And he, in that inauguration of Nevada's admission, enabling, he even said that Nevada was an independent, sovereign state, equal to all other states. And so we go back to this charter, or this constitution, which limits the federal government in their property ownership in the state, and we ask, well, what is that limitation? And the ranchers began to understand that. The attorneys that were representing the ranchers began to understand that, and many others have understood in the past, that the limitation is under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. And it basically states that in order for the federal government, and I'm paraphrasing here, and you can go to that and read it yourself, but in order for the federal government to own land, property, excuse me, inside a state, there are 3 steps that they have to follow. And first, they have to get consent from the state legislatures. So they actually have to go to the state legislatures. They have to get permission from them, which means the state legislatures have to vote on it. They have to vote whether this block of land can be, the jurisdiction of this block of land can be turned over to federal jurisdiction rather than state. Second, they have to purchase it, meaning whosever property it is, whether it belongs to, a private individual or a state or whatever, then they have to purchase it. And third, they have to get they can only use it for specific purposes, and that would be for the purpose of, as it says in the Constitution, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. And so basically for military purposes, primarily for the defense of the nation, and also for other buildings such as post offices and so forth. And so the ranchers began to understand this. They began to see that this was the limitation, and they could see very clearly that there was no clause that in the Constitution that allowed the federal government to own vast amounts of land inside the states. And this is where they began to take a stand.
This may be a good place to take a quick breather. I love the background you're giving us here, Ammon. And would you be up to some phone calls today if the occasion presents itself?
Absolutely. Maybe we could do it at the end of my show here. Absolutely.
Okay. You are listening to Ammon Bundy. We will be back right after this. And we welcome you back. Yes, that is the Joe Carey music that you're hearing, but this is actually Ammon Bundy's radio show that you've tuned into this afternoon. And Ammon, you were in the first segment laying out some of the background, some of the history behind how the lands on which your family has been ranching for a very, very long time are slowly but surely being encroached upon through federal authority. And I'd invite you, let's pick up where you left off.
Yeah, so the kind of to kind of outline it again, basically what's happening is this, these federal agencies, these federal entities had claimed the rights of my family and the rights of many others. And so, and to the point where they said, not only is it ours, but we are also now removing you from the land. And of course, the ranchers and my father, being one of them, wasn't willing to just accept that and walk away. And during this study of many, many years of trying to understand where their rights are and where they can fight this, they landed squarely on the Constitution. And a large part of that was in Article 1817, which limits the federal government to their control and of property inside a state. And I went through the requirements that the federal government must follow. They must get consent from the state legislatures, they must purchase it, and they can only use it for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. And besides this, they have no permission or authority to control land, property actually, inside the states that are admitted, which Nevada has been. And so once they begin to understand this and truly, internalize that this was the limitations, then they began to fight on that premise. My father, in particular, began to go to the other ranchers, began to communicate this with them, and began to say, hey, look, we have to stand on the Constitution of the United States. That is the limitation that protects us. And many agreed. But when it come down to the nuts and bolts of it, I remember as a young man, going around and my dad pleading with the ranchers to just stand on this and to say that the federal government, the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and many other entities, U.S. Forest Service, that they do not have jurisdiction or enumerated powers to be able to take and control these lands. And even though many ranchers agreed, they also were afraid, very afraid. They were afraid that what would happen at Ruby Ridge, eventually what would happen in Waco, would happen to them if they stood and said, no, that this is not your land, this is our land, that it's under the jurisdiction of the county and the jurisdiction of the state, and that the federal government has very limited jurisdiction on these matters. And so that's kind of where they stood. They stood, okay, Cliven, I think you're right. Cliven's my father. He goes, I think you're right, but we're not sure if we don't think that we could stand. And if we stand against the federal government, the most powerful government ever known to man, that they will take our lives, or they'll take our ranches, they'll take our heritage, and ultimately we'll end up with nothing. And no matter what, in my view, my experience, I should say, no matter what my dad said, he could never get them over that fear, over the fear of what they might face if they stand on their rights. But my dad and actually one other neighbor, Keith Ney, had determined that it was not only the right thing to do, but it was necessary, and also that it was the moral thing, the ethical thing, that they, once they knew this and understood the truth, that they couldn't just turn away from it, that they had to stand on their rights. And so they went through a process which is, we call nullification. And they nullified their grazing contracts with the federal government. Now, interesting enough, my father, as many may know, maybe not, but the federal government legally knows that they do not have jurisdiction over these lands. They know that. They know they don't have a constitutional premise. Legally, they understand this, and I saw this in the courts. I went through, two major court battles, through two major trials while incarcerated for almost 2 years, and I saw that they understand what they're doing legally. And so one of the things that they did to ensure their grasp on these lands, when it comes to the ranchers, and they do it to the loggers and miners as well, is they require the ranchers to sign a grazing contract or a grazing permit. Now, what that permit does is it holds it outside the constitutional bounds, meaning it becomes a contractual law rather than a constitutional law, if you will, because the rancher agrees to allow the Bureau of Land Management to manage their ranch. And so it becomes like a business agreement, almost, a corporation agreement between two entities. The rancher signs the contract saying that I will abide by all the policies and regulations of the Bureau of Land Management, that I authorize the Bureau of Land Management to manage my land, my ranch, right? And then the contract also says that if I default, meaning not allowing the Bureau of Land Management to manage my land, if I default, that the Bureau of Land Management can take me to court, into a federal court, and the federal judge will determine whether I violated this contract or not. So that's what would happen. If a rancher decides that he's not going to take his cattle off when the Bureau of Land Management says, or he leaves them on a little too long or whatever, the lawyers of the Bureau of Land Management take him to a federal court. The federal judge says, look here, here's the contract. Rancher, you agreed to this. And then it says that because you agreed to this, and you violated it, that you'll be kicked off the land, or that the land, you'll no longer be able to go on there. And he makes his ruling. He slams the hammer down, the mallet down, and makes a ruling. And so what the Bureau of Land Management has done, and the federal agencies have done, is they've given themselves contractual authority, even though they never had constitutional authority. And that's very important to understand that, because they claim that they manage these lands, and their legal authority is only contractual and not constitutional. And so, and the ranchers, they didn't understand this. At first, when grazing contracts first come out, it was in 1934 under the Taylor Grazing Act, and it was just supposed to be a mutual agreement as far as improvements on the land. And I can get into that a little bit later, but it developed into the federal government claiming the land and actually saying that they have authority to manage it, control it, and they transferred that right of the ranchers over to their right through permits. And this doesn't just happen on ranches. This happens in businesses. This happens all the time with the government. We can get into that a little bit more later. But first, we're going to do a break here, and I'll come back and explain a little bit more of the process of what happened to my family and how very similar it is happening to you in your life, and it's happening to people across this great country. So
stand by. We'll be back with more with Ammon Bundy right after these messages.
The sun's finally out, so get out there and enjoy. And don't forget to bring along the refreshing sound of KTALK Media, 1640 AM.
Hay muchos asuntos de inmigración en las noticias. Hay cambios rápidos que están pasando en la ley. Mi nombre es Allison Johnson y soy abogada con Peace Legal. Trabajo con individuos, familias y empleados en sus asuntos de inmigración. Ustedes tienen derechos y protecciones bajo la ley. No tengan miedo de ejercer sus derechos. Están allí para protegerles y ayudarles. Nuestro sitio de web es peacelegal.net. Tenemos 5 oficinas aquí en Utah, en Ogden, Salt Lake City, Sandy, Orem y Spanish Fork. Si usted desea hablar con un abogado de inmigración, favor de llamar 801-872-3451. Mi nombre es Allison Johnson y el número de teléfono es 801-872-3451. Favor de llamar para una consulta gratis.
Peace Legal. We're a refreshingly different type of law firm. Other law firms charge clients by the minute. Sometimes you're afraid to call your lawyer because you're worried about the cost. Not with Peace Legal. You have the option in most cases between hourly billing and flat fee billing. With flat fee billing, you know how much your case will cost up front. One flat fee, no hidden costs, and no charges to speak with your lawyer. We specialize in family law, adoptions, divorce, prenuptial agreements, and enforcement of custody and support orders. We also work with businesses and nonprofits, with planning, contracts, and employment issues. We also handle what we call life law matters. These are those cases that arise just by living life, buying a home, rental agreements, power of attorneys, and traffic and DUI matters. We have 5 offices in Orem, Ogden, Salt Lake City, Sandy, and Spanish Fork. Visit us at peacelegal.net. That's peacelegal.net, or call us at 801-876-LAWS. That's 801-876-5297. Our consultations are free, and we will always work hard for you. Peace Legal. We're a refreshingly different type of law firm.
Everyone loves liberty. Our rights come from God, not from government. So why are you letting other people tell you what's best for your health care? Exercise your freedom with Liberty Health Share. Liberty Health Share is a community of people who voluntarily share one another's medical costs. Liberty Health Share is founded on the idea that most people truly want to help one another. Healthcare sharing allows members to do just that as a true community that supports one another in times of need. Liberty believes people should make decisions for themselves and their families. Members are able to take back the freedom to make their own decisions about their health care. Freedom from guilt or doubt about how your money is used. You have the freedom to direct your health care, not to be dictated to by bureaucrats. Stop letting others tell you what to do and join a community of like-minded people. Exercise your freedom. Join Liberty Health Share and take back the control of your health care while helping those around you. Call us at 855-58-LIBERTY for more information, or check us out online at libertyhealthshare.org. That's libertyhealthshare.org.
And welcome back. Ammon Bundy will be rejoining us momentarily. We want to take a quick moment here to remind you of the event coming up on Constitution Day. I'm sure you had September 17th circled on your calendar, and we're already planning something special. So let me just add this quick invitation. Join us for the national launch of Mom Talks. You've heard of TED Talks, okay? You'll get the idea. Mom Talks will be launching at Liberty Hall in Far West, Utah, just north of Ogden, on Monday, September 17th. From 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., it's a full program. Wonderful speakers like Sam Sorbo. She's an actress, she's a writer, she's a wonderful person, and she's the wife of, you remember Hercules from television? Kevin Sorbo? Yeah, this is his wife. Also, Burgess Owens, who you hear every weekday on these very airwaves, will be speaking. Kate Daly, national radio host, will be speaking. And also Jeff Hymas, among others. There are some wonderful speakers, and an open house will follow from 2 to 5 p.m. Now, the tickets are $35. That includes lunch. The open house is a great chance to see this incredible facility, Liberty Hall, and at 7 o'clock that night, the unveiling of a statue by Angela Johnson. It's a sculpture that is of George Washington that is just breathtaking, and of course, you are invited. So go to momtalks.org for all the information you need, how to get tickets, all the bios on all the speakers and everything, and we'll hope to see you 1 week from Monday at Liberty Hall in Far West, Utah, as we celebrate Constitution Day in the best possible way. Now let's get back to Ammon. And Ammon, I've really enjoyed your explanation thus far of how by little steps, incremental steps, the federal government has insinuated itself into places that the founders never intended it to be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One part that I really want to focus on is that there is a absolutely contradiction or conflict that the Constitution has when it comes to these bureaucratic contractual laws. And they have, the Constitution does allow an individual or even the federal government to go into contract, at least it appears that it does, with certain entities. And they have taken that power and basically usurped our constitutional rights and the protections. And that, I talked about it last week a little bit, about how these two conflict, how basically my family's grazing rights established by prior appropriation and beneficial use and deeded in the state of Nevada come in direct conflict with the policies and regulations of the Bureau of Land Management. And how is that possible? Well, the way it's possible is because the Bureau of Land Management, the federal agencies, have used federal funding and contractual law to basically usurp these powers away from the people and these rights away from the people. And that's what was happening, and that is what's happening. And so my father and Keith Ney decided that they had to get rid of these contracts. Therefore, they could no longer be held under contractual law. So my father actually waited to his contract expired, and then he wrote a notice to the General Solicitor's Office notifying him that he will no longer be signing a contract, that he no longer needs the Bureau of Land Management to manage his ranch, which he kindly said, "You're managing me out of business." And then when the 10-year contract came up, he no longer signed it. Now, I will say this, for 3 years before he decided that they would no longer sign the contract, he actually did agree to the annual contract, I believe, and he can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but he basically wrote that he was forced to sign this contract, and so he was signing it under protest. But the point being that ultimately he and Keith Ney rid themselves of this contractual law that they were held under. Well, this became a big problem to the federal government because now they couldn't drag them into federal court and say they violated the contract because there was no contract. And people want to say, well, if this happened in the early 1990s, then why did it take them clear until 2014 to come with an army and try to destroy, my family's ranch and take our ranch away? And the reason why is because they had no legal premise to take my father's ranch away. He had rid himself of any contract that he had. So with that, same premise, my dad just went to ranching. And he just ranched on his original rights. He had deeds with the state of Nevada. He owned the water rights, the livestock watering rights. He owned the grazing rights, and he had deed to them. And he ignored the federal government and their unconstitutional position of claim on his ranch. And so, moving on, they eventually thought that they could get him for, get him for basically not having a contract. They thought that their regulations were strong enough. And basically, my dad argued that they did not have jurisdiction. This is the other thing to understand, and that is the Constitution under Article 3, which is where the courts the federal courts get their power. The Constitution basically lists what jurisdiction the federal courts have, and it basically says between two states, between somebody in another state and a party in another state, and it also lists that it says in there any dispute or that the federal government is party to, and that's paraphrasing. So pretty much that any dispute or any matter that the federal government is involved in, the federal courts have jurisdiction. Well, there's a little bit of a problem here, because what we see and what was happening in our family's case is that the federal government did not have any jurisdiction, constitutional jurisdiction, on these matters inside the state, that the real estate and property matters jurisdiction belongs to the state, yet because they have enforced themselves into the state, then they become party. And therefore, these matters, naturally were going to the federal courts, even though they shouldn't be. They should be handled on a state court. And hopefully that makes sense. They were basically claiming that the federal government has matters in these issues, even though the federal government was not constitutionally supposed to be there. And so my father tried multiple times to get these matters heard in the state courts, but they always kept deferring and pushing them into the federal courts. And what we saw in the federal courts were they were always going to protect themselves. And in fact, my dad many times says that going into a federal court, fighting the federal government and the federal agencies with federal prosecutors and federal attorneys, and and the federal rules of regulations in the court, is like a man coming into your home beating up your wife and children. So you take the man to court to get justice. When you're in the courtroom, they say, "All arise to the honorable judge," and in walks a man in a black robe, and it's the very man who beat up your wife and children. And so that was the experience that my father was having. He knew the federal government did not have any constitutional jurisdiction. He removed himself from any contractual jurisdiction that the federal government might have on him from signing his rights over to them. And then the federal courts didn't know what to do with him for many, many years. And then finally, the Bureau of Land Management pulled him over into the federal courts, which was an Article 3 court. We can get into that, how incorrect that was. And basically said that my dad's position on constitutionality was moot, which means that it didn't matter. And that's how they kept ruling. And they ruled that way, and basically a court order was issued for Cliven Bundy to remove his cattle from the land. And we'll go to that point and kind of go on from there. I'll talk about a little bit about the court battle, and then on into 2014 when we saw 213 armed federal agents surrounding our ranch, including snipers on the hills. Yeah, he wasn't trying to be a renegade. He wasn't trying to be anything but what he felt was right and what was needed to preserve, his livelihood, his ranch, but also the liberties and livelihoods of all those around him. And that's the way my father thinks. He has no ill intent. He has a good heart and loves all of those around him. So the source is the right place to go, and this show is where you're going to find it when it comes to our family and many other things. And I'll be on every Thursday at 12 o'clock Mountain Standard Time from 12 to 1. I think at this point I probably ought to give the remainder of the time to our callers. So if we want to go to the callers, that would be great, Brian.
Okay, the number is 801-254-1640. We'll take as many as we can in the time that we have. Ray has been patiently waiting his turn to get a chance to speak with you. Ray, go ahead. You're on the air with Ammon Bundy.
Thank you, Ammon. I consider this an honor. Everything you've been through, you and your family, I think it shows a lot of character and what your true intentions are. And I'm glad that you're laying a foundation. And now my comment and question might be better answered in the following weeks. I'm not sure, because I really like how you're laying a foundation of truth. And first, I would just like to preface my question with that in World War II, when we defeated the Germans and the Japanese, even by war, we did not steal their land. We overthrew their corrupt politicians and their kings and their and even in Italy, and we gave the land back to the people to decide what type of government they would have, and we helped them get back on their feet. And I never thought it would come to where in this land, we Americans, our government, we would allow them to be stealing land from Americans. It just shocks me to no end, and it's so obvious this is not right. Even when the government has national parks, which I do like national parks, if they don't go overboard with them, the people that are living on the land get to keep those cabins and that land and pass it down to their families. But so my question is, my two main concerns is, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer them this show, that it's my understanding that your father's lawyer said that Obama put aside $100 million to go after your family that only owned 150 acres. And that's my first question. This is outrageous that Obama was part of this. What doesn't surprise me. And my second question is, I want to know what happened to all your 53 neighbors. And why couldn't they put the turtles somewhere else? The government owns so much land, and why did they kill 200 turtles?
Okay, let's give Ammon a chance to answer those questions.
So first of all, to answer the first question, it is reported that the government spent around $100 million trying to prosecute us through this process. And I don't know where all that goes or where it all went, but that is reportedly the amount that they spent. Now, that's not what the Bureau of Land Management spent trying to, collect our cattle and do all of that. That's just what they spent in the, court proceeding processes. And then second is, about the turtles and so forth. It was just all based on false science, and you have to understand that the goal here was not to protect the turtles. It wasn't to do any of that. It was simply to take the land and to be able to control the land and resources. We have to understand that true wealth comes from the land and the resources. Everything we eat, everything we use, the cars we drive, the computers we use, the phones we talk on, the paper we write on, everything comes from the land. And if you can control the natural resources that come from the land, if you can be the one that says, that whether this comes out of the land or that comes out of the land or how it's used, and if you can profit on that, you become the most powerful entity in the world. And they understand this. This is about land control, about taking the power of land into one body rather than diversifying it to the private property owners throughout this country. And so I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Ray, thank you so much for your questions. Next we have Jay standing by. Jay, go ahead. You're on the air with Ammon Bundy.
Hi, Ammon. Nice to hear your voice in the program. Question I have for you is, first off, I was down there with the many other people supporting you in your in 2014. So I do support you. But my question, I've heard rumors that the land acquisition that the feds were trying to take had something to do with solar panels or Chinese companies and Reed's son possibly doing some stuff. And that was just one rumor I heard. I just want to know, what was the real reason they wanted you off the land? I mean, I obviously I disagree with them taking any reason, but what is it that they wanted to do? Just take your rights and your property, and what were they going to do with it? I mean, there has to be some other motive.
Well, the motive is, the underlining motive was to get control of the land and the resources so that they could benefit from it. Now, there was many ways in which they tried to do this. One was solar panels. And what was happening there is Harry Reid actually had a deal with the Chinese corporation to put in a large solar farm. And in order to do that, he had to pacify the environmentalists because it was going to take up a large amount of area. And so they said, well, any desert tortoise in that area needs to go to another area. So there needs to be a mitigation area. And that mitigation area was also our ranch. It was the same as the expansion of Las Vegas. They said, well, Las Vegas is expanding, so therefore we have to put these desert tortoise that we're going to expand into an area. And that ended up being our ranch. And so, so my father and 53 other ranchers, under their thought process, we're going to lose our ranch to the desert tortoise. And my father now is the only one left. He's the only rancher in that area left. So hopefully that answers your question. But again, it comes to federal land control. That's what it comes to.
All right, Jay, thank you for your call. I think we're kind of up against the clock here. We've got just a little bit over a minute to go until we are done. What do you want people to take home from today's program, Ammon? If there's one central idea that your listeners can take away from this, what would you want them to remember?
Well, I want them to remember that there's a contradiction between these federal policies and regulations and the Constitution. And the true protection comes from the Constitution, and that's what we stood on. And that's why my father is ranching still today. All his cattle are on the ranch, and he is ranching today. And also I want to understand that, that a lot of what you've heard in the media probably is not correct. And I want to lay that out and correct this narrative. And also, so next week we will continue on. We'll talk about the details. We'll learn from it. And eventually I'll kind of get to the end of the story, at least chronologically, and we're going to go into a whole slew of things in this on this show, such as natural rights, how property rights are established more, that you live on this earth, so you have a right to live. You have to have a place to live, right? And how that all works, and how it works in a way where we don't have to fight over it. And so I invite you back next week on Thursday at 12 o'clock Mountain Standard Time to the Liberty Effect Show, and with Ammon Bundy myself. And thank you for being here.